Welcome everybody again to another episode of the ideaXme show. I'm Andrea Macdonald, the founder of ideaXme. ideaXme is a global network, a podcast, creator series and mentor program. More recently, we've launched a research project called Rich Connectedness, where we look at the connections human to human that move the human story forward. Today in 2021, we sit in the information age in which all of us are encouraged to connect with vast numbers of people across the world, most of whom we've never met. In this episode of the ideaXme series, we're going to look at a more local level of connection. We're going to look at rich connectedness, human to human, and rich connectedness at a cellular level. I'm here with the founder of the $10 million Evolution 2.0 prize. The international competition is intended to speed breakthroughs around the still unknown process of cell communication that organizers predict can turn off cancer, allow robots to think for themselves, and even create new plant life to combat climate change. No one knows how the cell came about. But there's a simpler, more fundamental question. Where did the information come from? An answer will trigger a quantum leap in artificial intelligence. This may be as big as the discovery of DNA itself. So let's find out more. Who are you?
Hi, I'm Perry Marshall. I'm from Chicago. I'm founder of the Evolution 2.0 prize, which is a $10 million prize for the origin of the genetic code. I'm also author of a number of business books, including 80/20 Sales and Marketing, Ultimate Guides to Google and Facebook Ads. And I'm involved in cancer research and virus research and all kinds of interesting things. And to me, it all connects. It all flows together. And I'm happy to be talking to you today. So nice to meet you, Andrea.
It's wonderful to meet you too, and thank you very much for coming on the show again. Today I'd like to explore rich connectedness, human to human, but also extremely importantly at a cellular level. You have spoken about communications with cells potentially being at the heart of curing cancer, curing climate change, developing a higher form of artificial intelligence, finding out where we all came from, the origin of life. So let's start. Rich connectedness.
Well, I think the starting point of rich connectedness is that all living things, virtually without exception, are communal. One of my mentors, James Shapiro, wrote a book in the 1980s called Bacteria as Multicellular Organisms. In fact, it's right behind me. And it explains in beautiful detail that that even something as seemingly simple as let's say you leave a coffee cup, you had coffee with cream and sugar in it, sat on the counter for a week, and there's mold growing on the top of it. Those little mold cells they're not just little lone rangers eating everything they can find. They form communities and they cooperate and they divide up labor. They do division of labor as though different parts of the colony were different organs, and they actually changed their genetic expression and rearrange their genes to better serve the function that they've been assigned by the colony. And they have words like you and me and us and them, and they talk to each other. And I'm not just joking. Like, this is not just a silly little metaphor that you would tell the children. This is actually what they do. Okay. And so they're small, but they're not stupid. And so you can just zoom out to any level of magnification that you want, and you'll see the same pattern repeating over and over and over again. What's the worst thing you can do to a human being? Just about is put them in solitary confinement. So I think there's much for us to learn from nature, especially with the political and social debates and polarization that's going on in the world. There's nothing more apt than looking at nature.
Can we go back to the beginning of where this human-to-human connection, I know it was with your brother that sort of led you on along this pathway. You were already hugely successful within the marketing and advertising world, but it was this important connection, a rich connection with your brother, and then with a little serendipity thrown in, working on the Ethernet, simultaneously having a fascination with DNA, which was linked to the heated discussions you were having with your brother, led to this breakthrough, which you don't want to state as fact. You have said that it has led to a number of key questions you have in relation to the origin of life and communication within cells. Can you start at the human-to-human connection side of this story?
Yes. So I think all human stories are family stories. I mean, even if we're talking about the Republican Party, or if we're talking about the United Nations, it's all family dynamics. And so my younger brother, he and I took different paths. I went into business and marketing and entrepreneurship. He went to seminary. He was studying to go into the ministry. We're both pastors' kids. And he, instead of being a pastor, he actually ended up moving to China, teaching English and doing missionary work on the side. And so he started asking lots of questions and asking hard questions. And in a lot of ways, he was growing up. And so, like, we started having discussions and debates. He started really questioning, like, all this space stuff that I think I believe, do I really believe all this? Does this really make sense? So I went to visit him in China, and I discovered, to my surprise, that he had pretty much thrown it all out the window. It's like, I don't believe this anymore. It's like, the earth is not 6,000 years old, and I don't, I'm really not sure about all this Bible stuff. And so this was very upsetting, because it was a complete, I'm fast forwarding 6 months, like, well, 6 months from now, it's going to be Thanksgiving. And, and I don't think we're going to have the same sort of Thanksgiving dinner that we had last time. Cause he's about to become the family atheist. And so this, like, really was messing with me. And so we were riding together in this little bus, and I said, Brian, I said, look at the hand at the end of your arm. I said, this is a nice piece of engineering, and I'm an engineer, I should know. And you don't think this is an accumulation of random accidents, do you? And he goes, hold on. And he just came right back with, everybody's had this argument with somebody. You don't need some, deity tinkering with things. Life evolves on its own, and all you need is time and natural selection, and you get some copying errors with DNA, and that's all you're going to get a hand. And I remember thinking, well, I've spent 5 years in engineering, and there's a lot of weird stuff that's very counterintuitive, and I already know this. And so I have an intuition about this, but I know a lot of biologists would agree with him and not me. And frankly, I know I don't know. And us sitting here arguing is just making us miserable. It's kind of ruining a little vacation trip. Why don't I just shut up and go figure this out when I get home. And that's what I did. And it sent me down a deep rabbit hole that I couldn't have imagined. I would have never done that had I not been shaken to the core, because I was sufficiently comfortable with my existing beliefs and so on. But he kind of forced the question. And I think a subtext to this whole entire story was, well, I want to maintain a good relationship with my brother despite our assumptions are all being shaken and they're changing. And I have to figure this out in a way that is honoring to our relationship. And that ended up being a really important determination, because as things moved forward, I'd say within a few months, he became completely disinterested in continuing to argue about any of it. He was just, it wasn't that he had made up his mind. He still had tons of questions, but arguing and debating was not going to be a good way for him to sort it out. And meanwhile, he had seeded me with a ton of questions that I now needed to go find answers to. And so I had to go out on my own. And so I couldn't work this out in some sort of codependent, well, as long as I'm smart enough to convince Brian, it's all okay. No, he's like, I don't want you to try to convince me. Go talk to somebody else. Go convince them. And him deciding to do that was a big part of how I decided to engage with a much wider part of the world. And in hindsight, that was absolutely crucial.
So you went on to launch the Evolution Prize 2.0. Were you in search of, what was your major motivation? Because the story that you describe was sparked by spiritualism in a sense.
Yeah.
Well, it was. But then the Evolution Prize is absolutely rooted in science.
Yes.
You're saying that the two are connected: spiritualism, yep. God, and the part of science that we still need to crack: evolution, cancer, climate change. Your brother ended up, I'm not sure if he still is, president of your company.
He is just in the process of moving on to some other things, but yeah, okay. He was the president of my company for about 12 years.
Yes.
We've had a great relationship.
So as an atheist, he was president of your company, presumably not just because he's your brother, although of course that's a factor. He was president of your company because he believed in the science. So can you talk a little bit about your process of not just convincing him of the science, but can you describe your journey of corralling all these top scientists of the world to support the Evolution Prize, and then go on to talk of the cellular level?
Well, so where this connected spirituality and science for me was that before I ever had that conversation, I had a very primal, intuitive, also experiential perspective, which was, I'm an engineer. I've designed lots of things. I understand all of the very careful thought and analysis and trade-offs and everything that happens when you design anything. When I look at a hand, I see a remarkable set of choices that have been made. Therefore, a hand is purposeful. Therefore, life is purposeful. I know this as an engineer. Therefore, this doesn't exactly, prove God, or it doesn't make a big theological statement. But to me, at least, it all points everything in the direction of, something very big and purposeful going on in the universe. And I was always comfortable that that was necessarily true. Brian was challenging that. He's like, no, blind, purposeless processes will do this. Well, what I realized was any theory of evolution is a theory of engineering. If a camera is something that an engineer designs, and if evolution produces an eye, and an eye is like a camera, then evolution is engineering. So wait a minute. There's a bunch of missing stuff that nobody ever even mentioned in engineering school. There must be some whole missing thing here, okay? Well, it turned out there was, but I had no idea what it was. And I think most importantly, none of the popular evolution books were actually properly explaining it. I mean, to be completely honest, the popular books were mostly terrible. They left out entire professions of science and just sort of pretended that the last 50 years of molecular biology never even happened. And I was so puzzled by this, but I didn't know what the missing part was. Well, the best term for the missing part was something that is now called natural genetic engineering, which is, and you can look it up. There's a Wikipedia entry, and you could go like, go on the rabbit trail. But basically, it's that. See, Brian and I were arguing about. Brian's like, cells are not engineered, and I'm like, cells are engineered. And the truth was, cells are engineers. That's the truth. Now, there's no question, like when you read the literature, if you study bacterial resistance to antibiotics, if you study viruses, if you study cancer, oh my goodness, the level of engineering that cells do in real time, evolving in real time, it's astonishing. But what was interesting was that it's not particularly politically correct to describe it in the exact way that I just have, because it raises too many unanswered questions. And so I became very interested in the unanswered questions. What I found was the polarized sides of the debate, they were all clinging to certain answers that they had or that they thought they had, and they were just using them like sticks to beat the other side. Okay, but what I saw was there was this very deep well between the two sides. It was like, well, if I come off of this little hill over here and this one over here, it's like there's this Grand Canyon in the middle that nobody's really talking about. And it's just laden with treasures, like unbelievable. And so to make a very long story short, I realized that the best way to put a spotlight on the unanswered questions was pick the biggest unanswered question I could find and attach a $10 million prize to it. And I did. And I needed to find judges. What I found was that most scientists, this was too hot a potato to be associated with. And the only scientists who in their careers could afford to be associated with something controversial like this were rock stars. Okay? So, like George Church he's one of the most famous geneticists in the world. His student Jennifer Doudna just won the Nobel Prize about 4 months ago. And everybody in genetics knows who he is. And I said to George, George, do not do this if you don't want controversy. He goes, Perry, everything I do is controversial. I'm trying to recreate woolly mammoths at Harvard. Like, I mean, don't worry about it. It's fine. And, Dennis Noble, same thing. Like, Dennis has been intensely interested in the parts of evolution that nobody's been discussing. really for about 50 years, because he's 84. And he, because he's retired, he has the academic freedom to pretty much do anything he wants. And so he has created a group called the Third Way of Evolution, which is really bringing all this stuff to the forefront. And what, so here's what I found, and I find, by the way, I've consulted in hundreds of industries. I find this to be consistently true in any field. It can be science, it can be medicine, it can be chiropractic, it can be bowling alleys, okay? But here's the truth. So you have these layers of, you got the rank and file, and then you got the management, and then you got the administration. And, what I would, at the very top, you have the true adventurers and innovators. And what the adventurers and innovators always have the courage to do is to kick over the sacred idols and cows and question everything. And it just doesn't bother them that we don't know certain things. It terrifies everybody else. And so what I find is that the very best people who have earned a certain degree of respect have the latitude to go ask the hard questions. And if you have lunch with them, you'll find out that their mind is like a playground of, like, there's way more stuff than you even hear them talking about. It's also a key difference between, like, Einstein and Niels Bohr and Schrodinger, and, like, even the more recent modern, the very best ones, they were way more willing to question the boundaries of everything than everyone else. Isaac Newton was the same way. In fact, Isaac Newton has been boxed in by historians as being like some kind of a reductionist. He spent 20 years of his life doing alchemy experiments, which would horrify most of the people who worship him. But he was out on the bleeding edge, trying crazy stuff. And so, and Andrea, this has been the most fascinating thing about it, is because it's like there's a point where you break through the clouds and it's sunshiny again. And the earth is not all gray. And man, like, I just want to encourage people, because I know there's no way that the people listening to this podcast are not kind of like me, okay? If you're listening to this podcast, like, you're asking big questions. And most people who ask big questions are, you're just sort of lost in some university or some institution, and, you're trying to get a scholarship, or you're trying to get a fellowship, or you're trying to get a job, or you're trying to get a promotion or whatever. And you're dealing with the mundane, so much of your life. And then but like, maybe, an hour a day, you can go over here and you can kind of chisel away at something. Like, dude, keep chiseling. And, like, because most people overestimate what they can achieve in 1 year and underestimate what they can achieve in 5.
In launching the prize, I'm really fascinated to hear whether further it led to unanticipated questions being asked of the prize and you and the scientists involved. What happened after the launch of the prize?
Well, so the official launch of the prize was a little less than 2 years ago. And, I kind of, so you do things like this and you have this idea of how it's going to go. And then there's, like, how it actually goes, and what I thought would happen would be that it would generate a lot of, like, newspaper headlines and social media, and it might go viral. That's not really what happened. What happened was, probably, well, within some number of months, I got contacted by one of my science friends, James Shapiro, and a couple of his friends. One of them was Frank Laukien at Bruker Corporation, and they wanted to put together a evolution in cancer conference. And I said, yeah, in a hot second, I'm all over it. Let me help you. And now, what on earth does an Origin of Life prize have to do with cancer? Well, actually, everything, because fundamentally is the same question underneath both of them, which is, where does information come from? And where does intelligence come from? And how is it produced, and how does it work? Well, the answer is nobody knows. But the fundamental problem with cancer is that cells are intelligent, and cancer cells are intelligent, and tumors are intelligent. And when you nuke a tumor with chemo, it's kind of like dumping napalm on a Vietnamese village. And what happens is, well, if you don't kill all of them, if you only kill 98% of them, the 2% that you didn't kill, they're coming back and they're mad. Okay. And they're going to get every kind of gun, weapon, knife, boat, submarine, nuclear weapon, airplane, missile, and they're going to come back at you. And so one of the things that the Cancer and Evolution Symposium did was it brought all of these forward thinkers from a bunch of different fields. I mean, a bunch of fields. And it wasn't just cancer. I mean, it was physics and chemistry and physiology and systems biology. And it's like, and they're all unafraid to ask these questions. And it's been one of the most enjoyable things I've ever done, is seeing all of that come together. And I just submitted a paper that should be published in the next couple of months, saying that actually Origin of Life, cancer, AI, evolution, and a couple of other things are all one question. They're not 6 questions. And it is delightful to be with people who think like that. And I think that's the kind of thinking that we're going to have in order to make progress on cancer. And yeah, it's thrilling, honestly.
It's really fascinating because we sit here in the information age, and even at a cellular level, it's all about information and communications, it would appear.
It is. It totally is. Like humans didn't invent the internet. Bacteria did. They've been communicating for 3 billion years, and they're way better at it than we are. Like way better. The technologies that humans produce are crude tinker toys. One blade of grass is 10,000 years ahead of any human technology. And I completely stand behind that statement. I think for the most part, we have drastically underestimated the power of nature. And it's one of the reasons why a lot of our problems aren't getting solved the way everybody said that we would.
The $10 million evolution prize is a real thing. There is a pot of money. You went after investors. I was listening to one of the talks of one of your investors and his story. Can you talk a little bit about how people go after this prize? If they think they have the solution, do they go? I think I read that teams can go and make a submission, but also individuals. Can anyone submit? And has anyone so far?
Yes, we actually get submissions every couple of weeks or so. To be quite honest with you, most of them are kind of pitiful. Okay, just to be perfectly blunt about it. but some of them are good and interesting. I'd say about once every 3 to 6 months, we get something that has some pretty interesting angles. And we do publish the interesting ones on our website. I think there's about 5 or 6 that we have asked the submitters to give us permission. And so you can go look through what they've sent in. And, nobody's really cracked it. I did get a phone call about a month ago from a fairly famous scientist. And I don't think this guy has ever called me on the phone. I was like, like somebody calls you out of the blue and you're like, why is he calling me? Right. And I answer the phone. He goes, Perry, I figured out the origin of the genetic code. And he was all excited. He goes, I'm 92% sure. I'm like, well, okay, well, hey man, send me what you got. So I'm still waiting for him, and I know what he's doing. He's like lining his ducks in a row and and all of that. So there's no telling. Look, this is a very hard problem, and people have working on it 100 years. But there's just something about when you draw attention to a particular problem, and people start paying attention to that particular problem, eventually, stuff starts to happen. And I think there's going to be serendipities. I think this is going to be, you thought you were going to answer this question, but you really ended up answering that question, which is beautiful. It's fine.
It's really fascinating that you say serendipities, because that goes back to your work on the Ethernet and your simultaneous interest about DNA because of your Rich Connectedness story with your brother. And that was serendipity.
Oh, yes. It was like my brain set on fire. Yes, it was incredible. Go ahead.
I'm really fascinated to hear. You speak of instinct quite a lot, and intuition.
Yes.
Intuitively, do you think if it is in fact a team that wins, intuitively, do you think the team will be comprised of, I mean, you've said that it needs multidisciplines, but do you think, how wide do you think the expertise needs to be? For example, should it include artists, bioartists, artists fascinated in exponential technology, as well as, I think you have a philosopher anyway on your team who is deliberately an atheist. I mean, of course, he's deliberately an atheist, but you chose him as well on the basis of that, because you, I think, didn't want to be seen as just pursuing religious motives. You
Right.
want this to be very much seen as a scientific project. But just intuitively, how do you see the A team?
I'll give you 2 answers to that. So the first answer is, about 5 years ago, I was out raising money, trying to get investors to back this thing. And I found myself in the office of the director of investments for the company in Dubai that built the Burj Khalifa, which was incredible. It was like, I mean, I just knew somebody, and he like, oh, here, let's go meet this guy. And really sharp guy. His name was Nasser Batha. And he looked at what I was doing, and he says, this is really cool. I love what you're doing. Unfortunately, I can't invest in this because my investment charter is real estate, and this is not real estate. But I know who's going to win this. I'm like, you do? Well, let's hear it. And he goes, I don't think an American scientist in a white lab coat is going to win this thing. I think it's going to be like a 14-year-old Montessori school kid from Sweden or Italy or some artistic country. And I thought, I could totally believe that. And now I think the point of that story is that, and he says, and when they figure it out, everybody will go, that is so obvious. Like, why didn't we think of that? And I think there is a part of this that is going to require people to be childlike. Okay. And I think there's a part of just setting aside what you know and being lost in the wonder of it and being willing to ask stupid questions. So,
Can,
yeah.
sorry to interrupt you. Could you elaborate upon that a little bit more and describe the problem in greater detail that these people need to solve, or children need to solve?
Well, so the problem is, where does information come from? Where does code come from? And if you look, so I'm an engineer and I wrote an Ethernet book, and if you look at digital code in the whole programming world, every bit of it comes from humans typing on keyboards, putting commands in and, writing programs. Like, that's where it all comes from. And language is code, and you and I talking is code, and our computers sending the information back and forth is code. It's all code, okay? And code is a sign of intelligence. Well, as soon as you're in evolution and you talk about intelligence, you just stepped on a landmine, because now, oh, you're talking about intelligent design, and that's creationism, and like the whole thing just blows up in your face. Well, okay, we can be politically correct about it, but let's just keep asking the questions, because if the question isn't answered, then we're just going to keep going. The reasoning was DNA is code, just like Ethernet or your computer is code. All the other codes are designed, therefore DNA is designed. But eventually, hey, wait a minute, cells are not just engineered, they're actually engineers. Okay, so what this actually brings you to is that the real question is actually, what is consciousness and where does that come from? It's not, we're not just talking about ones and zeros. This isn't just a computer science problem. This is also a philosophical problem. It's also an AI problem, because none of the AI has any of this. All the AIs are just as dumb as a box of rocks. I mean, you can kind of pretty up and you can tell a story about how smart Google is. If all of the engineers took their fingers off the keyboards at Google, the whole thing would crash. And I don't know if it'd take a day, an hour, or a week, or a month, but it would all eventually just grind to a halt. And it was like, we got to get to the real question behind all of this. And the real question is what drives biology? Now, to give like the second answer to your question is, I've been having this conversation with Ann Barker, who is former director of the National Cancer Institute. And she has been wanting to put together a bioinformatics group to really understand how information flows in biology. Because she would tell you, our understanding of how cells communicate is at the most rudimentary kindergarten level at this point in time. And we really need to understand it. And we've been talking about what kind of people do you bring into a project like that. And it was a lot like, Andrea, what you said. It needs to be incredibly smart people across any innumerable disciplines, including possibly art, psychology, music. I would definitely want musicians in a project like that. I remember Steve Jobs saying that like his top 12 engineers, like the really wicked good ones that pulled off the iPhone and pulled off the iPad, he said every single one of them had a major place for music in their life. And so going deeper and deeper and deeper into a discipline isn't how you solve this. I think you're going to find that the people who make progress they're very deep in multiple disciplines, and they're good at explaining them. Let me tell you another story that I think is very related. So I get this friend named Emerson Spartz. He's in his early 30s, and he's independently wealthy because He invested in cryptocurrency a few years ago. And he pretty much spends all of his time just learning anything he wants to learn. He's like a professional learner. And he'll literally pick up a subject. He's like, well, it's February. In March, I'm going to go learn about, like, I don't know, slime molds or whatever. Like, and so he'll just go down these rabbit holes. And he said something super interesting. He said, Perry, now that I've like gone deep in like 40 different fields, and he goes, here's the pattern. Here's what always happens. He goes, so I pick a field, I go into the field, I start reading all the experts. And, you know, after about 20 hours of reading, I've like figured out the terminology and who the major people are. And I'm starting to figure it out, kind of the lay of the land. And he goes, then somewhere in there, I find somebody who teaches me more in 1 hour than the previous 20 guys taught me in 20 hours. And he says that person is what I call an interdisciplinary explainer. They are always adept in not one field, but probably 4 or 5 completely different fields. And they can explain each of them in plain English. And that person gets me like leapfrog. And I almost, that person is never obvious at the beginning. I have to dig a few layers deep to find that person, but then I find it, and now all of a sudden I understand it completely. And when he said that, I'm like, I'll be darned. Like all the people that I've admired and followed in my learnings have been interdisciplinary explainers. I could make a whole list of them. And I think that kind of skill, anybody can cultivate it. You just have to decide to. That is how we get a new Renaissance. That is the signature of Renaissance thinking. It's connecting dots between seemingly unrelated fields, because it's actually all related.
It's all connected. And on that note, could you please give our audience the details of how they might apply for the Evolution Prize and find out more about you?
If you go to evo2.org, you can click on prize and it'll take you to the prize application thing. You can click on book and find out about my book, Evolution 2.0. It's all there. Just go to evo2.org. And in fact, on the homepage, there's a sign up, how to win the Evolution 2.0 prize. And it'll take you into a conversation I had where I say, well, when somebody wins this thing, here's like a dozen ways that I think they could possibly end up approaching it that would produce fruit.
Perry Marshall, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the IdeaXme show, which explores connection, rich connection, human to human, as well as cell to cell.
Thank you. That was beautiful.
Thank you very much for being with us on this episode of the IdeaXme show. IdeaXme is a global network. We're on all the major podcasting networks. You can find us at www.radioideaxme.com. You can find us on YouTube and Vimeo. Please subscribe.